The Soviet Union's deployment of outdated tanks like the T-55 and T-62 during the 1980s Afghan conflict, and Russia's continued use of similar aging equipment in Ukraine, raises critical questions about military strategy and resource allocation. Does reliance on older hardware indicate a nation is faltering, or is it a calculated decision rooted in logistical pragmatism? Many in the West believe that the presence of these antiquated tanks, rather than more modern and sophisticated equipment, is a sure sign that the Kremlin is on track to lose. Of course, as those same analysts would point out, the Soviets lost in Afghanistan. But in spite of many of the same disadvantages, Russia is gradually winning in Ukraine. Why the difference? Because Moscow never viewed the Afghan war as an existential struggle in the same manner that it views the Ukraine war. By examining historical contexts and current developments, we can better understand the implications of such military choices. There were a plethora of T-55s and T-62s left over in the USSR when the Soviet-Afghan War erupted. Moscow figured that their newer, more advanced T-72s and T-80s would be needed to continue deterring NATO's more advanced tanks arrayed against the Soviet bloc in Europe. Conversely, given the abundant supply of older T-55 and T-62 MBTs, as well as the fact that the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were by no means a near-peer adversary with sophisticated anti-tank weapons, the Red Army's leadership assessed their arsenal of T-55s and T-62s were more than sufficient for squelching the rebellion. Indeed, in a straight-up conflict, Soviet tanks deployed in Afghanistan were powerful elements. Of course, the Mujahideen's guerrilla tactics stunted many of the tactical advantages that the more advanced systems of the Red Army would have ordinarily conferred upon the Soviets. However, even with the added complication of the Mujahideen's guerrilla tactics, as well as the Kremlin's growing alarm at their copious support from the United States, Moscow did not believe it was necessary to divert their most advanced MBTs from the main theater of operations in Europe. Another aspect that few in the West appreciate about the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan was that many of the initial formations deployed by the Red Army were little more than rearguard formations from the USSR's Central Asian holdings. These elements had older systems and were not as well trained as the crack Red Army troops facing NATO in Europe. The T-55 MBT is considered to be one of the most widely produced and exported tanks in history. The Soviet Union's vast industrial capacity constructed roughly 100,000 units of the tank throughout its life, and it was widely exported to the developing world. Developed in the late 1940s and entering service in the 1950s, it was an evolution of the older T-54 that was specifically built to counter Western tanks such as the M48 Patton during the Cold War. T-55s came equipped with a 100mm D-10T rifled gun, capable of firing APHE, heat, and APDS rounds. These units also had a 7.62mm coaxial machine gun, and in some variants, a 12.7mm DSH Dushka anti-aircraft gun. T-55s featured frontal armor, up to 200mm effective thickness, and a low-profile turret, providing decent protection for their four-man crew against early post-World War II anti-tank weapons. A 580 horsepower V55 diesel engine powered the T-55, giving a top speed of 31 miles per hour. By the 1970s, the tank had become increasingly vulnerable to newer NATO weapons. Yet in Afghanistan, particularly at the start of the campaign, before Western aid to the Mujahideen really became a threat to the Red Army, these tanks were more than sufficient for countering light infantry. The T-62, the next variant in the Kremlin's tank arsenal, was the direct successor to the T-55. Entering service in 1961, it was an evolutionary design intended to bridge the gap between the T-55 and more advanced tanks like the T-64. Around 20,000 units were produced, and it saw extensive use by Soviet, Warsaw Pact, and export client states during the Cold War. T-62s had a 150mm T5TS smoothbore gun, the first of its kind on a production tank, capable of firing APFSDS, heat, and HE rounds. The larger barrel gave it superior penetration compared to the T-55's 100mm armament. It also had a 7.62mm PKT coaxial machine gun, and in some models a 12.7mm DSHK anti-aircraft gun. A cast turret and a sloped hull with up to 242mm effective thickness on the turret front and 100mm on the hull were its armor, an improvement over the T-55. Yet, like the T-55, the T-62 was still vulnerable to advanced NATO anti-tank weapons by the 1970s. The fact that the Soviets were using large numbers of their older tanks did not inherently mean that they were likely to lose. The Kremlin lost in Afghanistan for multiple reasons: Western support for the Mujahideen, innovative and brilliant guerrilla tactics by the rebels, the country's mountainous and inhospitable geography, and the fact that the Soviet Union's geriatric leadership was deeply ambivalent about Afghanistan from the outset, amid a sharp escalation in the Cold War and an increasingly tenuous economy. These elements culminated in the eventual withdrawal of Soviet forces by 1989, marking a significant moment in Cold War history. In the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Russia has reintroduced T-62 tanks, with reports indicating that these units are primarily used to support infantry and provide artillery support, rather than engage in direct tank-to-tank combat. This strategy suggests a pragmatic approach to utilizing available resources, especially in the face of significant equipment losses. The reactivation of older tanks is partly due to the depletion of more modern units and the challenges in producing new equipment at a pace that matches battlefield losses. While this reliance on outdated hardware might appear as a sign of weakness, it also reflects an adaptive strategy to maintain operational capabilities amid resource constraints. The contrasting outcomes of the Soviet-Afghan War and the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict highlight differences in military strategy and geopolitical context. Afghanistan's mountainous terrain favored guerrilla warfare, undermining the effectiveness of Soviet armored units. In contrast, Ukraine's varied landscape allows for more conventional military engagements, where tanks can still play a significant role. The Soviet Union faced widespread international condemnation during its Afghan campaign, whereas Russia's actions in Ukraine have led to a complex mix of sanctions, support for Ukraine, and geopolitical maneuvering. Russia's current military strategy shows a willingness to adapt, using older equipment in roles suited to their capabilities, and focusing on attrition tactics to wear down Ukrainian forces. In short, the deployment of outdated tanks by Russia does not necessarily indicate a losing position, but reflects a strategic choice to maximize available resources. While modern warfare often emphasizes cutting-edge technology, the effective use of existing equipment, even if outdated, can still contribute significantly to military objectives. Understanding these decisions requires a nuanced analysis of logistical realities, strategic goals, and the broader context of each conflict. Thanks for watching.